In the early hours of May 24, 1982, in the small Northern California town of Cloverdale, a 13-year-old girl named Sarah Ann Geer was found dead. Her life cut tragically short and her community shaken to its core. She was discovered partly hidden under a fence behind an apartment complex downtown, her body bearing evidence that she had been attacked elsewhere and dragged to that location. Sarah had spent the weekend at a friend's house and was dropped off around 9 p.m. on Sunday evening. The friend's parents watched her wave goodbye, but she never entered her home on 4th Street as expected. The following morning, a 6-year-old child stumbled upon her body near North Main Street. Police noted drag marks and found her shoes neatly aligned at the end of the alley, tragic clues to what had occurred. From that moment, hope dimmed. Over the following days, weeks, and months, investigators collected evidence. Sarah's death remained unsolved. The case haunted the town, etched in memory, edged with grief and enduring questions. The investigation lay dormant for decades, untouched by breakthroughs and unanswered by justice. Then, nearly 42 years after her death, the case was reopened in 2021 under the leadership of Police Chief Jason Ferguson and later continued by Chief Chris Parker, Detective Katie Vanoni, and private investigator Kevin Klein. Modern forensic science finally delivered answers. A male DNA profile extracted from preserved evidence was matched through genetic genealogy technology, identifying James Unick, then 62, of Willows, California. He was arrested and booked on multiple charges: murder, rape, kidnapping, and lewd and lascivious acts with a minor under 14 by force. Chief Parker called the arrest a bittersweet victory for justice, acknowledging that while nothing can undo the trauma inflicted on the Geer family, at least the case has been closed and the perpetrator held accountable. This is not a story built on sensationalism. It's the story of biology preserved over time, of technology finally catching up, of a family that waited decades for answers. It's a story of resilience, persistence, and late-found justice. And it demands we remember Sarah Ann Geer, because every life matters, no matter how long it takes to right the wrong. The victim's life and background. The girl's name was Sarah Ann Geer, a 13-year-old 7th grader at Washington School in Cloverdale, California. She was described by those who knew her as a typical young teen, enthusiastic about school, quietly friendly, and rooted in the love of her close-knit community. Sarah spent the weekend before her disappearance at a friend's house. That Sunday evening, around 9 p.m., she was dropped off, and those driving her saw her wave goodbye. But Sarah never made it home. Instead, she was last seen around 10 p.m. near a video game arcade on Cloverdale Boulevard, presumably looking for friends. There's a subtle yet powerful poignancy in normalcy. Sarah was doing nothing extraordinary, just what many teens might, visiting an arcade after dinner. It's this ordinariness that makes her story so relatable and heartbreaking. Her family and the whole town were catapulted into a state of shock once word spread. In the days that followed, they clung to hope. News accounts from the time say investigators worked swiftly, floating flyers, interviewing anyone who might have crossed Sarah's path. The community rallied behind her family, but as weeks turned to months, the momentum faded, and the trail went cold. Yet Sarah remained more than a headline. She was the daughter of a local nurse, a friend at school, a girl whose routines were now shattered, and whose absence stretched across decades. There were birthdays, school plays, and family gatherings she never saw, each one a reminder of her absence. This unfulfilled promise, these lost moments, are what kept the community's memory of Sarah alive. By focusing on who Sarah was, a teenager with everyday dreams, whose disappearance came on an otherwise ordinary Sunday evening, we don't just retell a crime story. We honor her life. This isn't about exaggeration. It's about connection. Your viewers will stay, because they're not just watching a case. They're witnessing empathy, and that emotional sincerity keeps attention longer than shock ever could. The day of the abduction. Shortly before the tragedy, Sarah Ann Geer had been spending the weekend at a friend's home. On the evening of Sunday, May 23, 1982, around 9 p.m., she was dropped off by her friend's parents, who watched her wave goodbye as she left, though they never saw her actually enter her home on 4th Street. It was a seemingly ordinary moment, one that would be the last time she was seen by those who loved her. Instead of heading straight home, Sarah walked downtown toward the video game arcade on Cloverdale Boulevard, an unremarkable detour on a suburban evening. Police determined she was last seen around 10 p.m., still alive, and headed toward what should have been a short, safe distance away. The next morning, tragedy revealed itself when a 6-year-old girl, playing behind an apartment complex on North Main Street, discovered Sarah's body partially tucked under a fence. The girl, who was the granddaughter of a city councilman, initially thought it might be someone sleeping, until she realized the truth. When officers arrived, they saw clear drag marks in the dirt, signs that she had been killed elsewhere and moved to conceal the crime. There was a heartbreaking detail. Her shoes were found deliberately lined up at the end of the alley. Investigators estimated that the crime occurred late at night, likely after midnight, based on a patrol officer's drive-through of that same alley between 11 p.m. and 12 a.m., and the absence of Sarah at that time. In the immediate aftermath, the investigation gained early traction. Police conducted interviews, administered polygraphs, and even involved a psychic, an indication of how deeply the community hoped for answers. They also collected blood and semen samples from the scene. Yet despite the apparent momentum, all leads dried up quickly. One of the most promising eyewitnesses was an older individual with unreliable memory, and the psychic's input added no concrete value, leaving the case stalled and unsolved. Sarah's disappearance struck at the heart of her community's sense of safety. This was reportedly Cloverdale's first homicide, a reality that intensified the shock and pressure on investigators. Early investigation. The murder of 13-year-old Sarah Ann Geer shocked Cloverdale. For a town that had never seen a homicide before, this crime instantly became its most urgent investigation. Police were under pressure, and in the first weeks, they pursued every possible lead. Detectives began with what they had: physical evidence from the scene, interviews with potential witnesses, and a list of known offenders in the area. According to reports, investigators collected blood and semen samples from Sarah's body and the location where she was found. These samples would become the foundation for solving the case, though in 1982, technology was far from ready to provide answers. KTVU.com. At the time, forensic DNA testing was not widely available. Crime labs could only perform limited blood type analysis, and genetic genealogy was decades away. Still, detectives preserved the evidence carefully, a decision that proved crucial nearly 40 years later. In the immediate aftermath, investigators canvassed the neighborhood. They spoke to residents of the nearby apartment complex, workers at local shops, and patrons of the arcade where Sarah was last seen alive. One witness, however, proved unreliable due to memory issues, and no clear suspect emerged. Another unusual step came when police consulted a psychic, reflecting the desperation to generate leads. But this yielded nothing usable. PressDemocrat.com. Detectives also examined whether Sarah might have known her attacker. In many cases, children and teens are harmed by someone they recognize. Yet interviews with family, classmates, and neighbors offered no indication that Sarah was threatened or fearful of anyone. Her routine was ordinary, her social circle stable. This lack of a direct connection left investigators without a starting point. By late summer of 1982, the investigation had stalled. With no arrests and no solid suspect, the case slipped from active pursuit into a frustrating limbo. The evidence was boxed and stored, waiting for a future that might bring stronger investigative tools. For the Geer family, the silence was devastating. For the community, it was unsettling. If the killer wasn't caught, Was he still nearby? Despite the lack of progress, the case was never fully forgotten. In later years, officers would occasionally revisit the files, hoping new techniques might help. But for decades, nothing concrete developed. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when DNA technology became a staple of law enforcement, that the preserved evidence gained new value. A male DNA profile was eventually developed from the samples taken in 1982, but without a database match, the trail still went cold. The persistence of the Cloverdale Police Department, however, kept the case alive. In 2021, Chief Jason Ferguson authorized a re-examination of the evidence using advanced forensic genealogy. Partnering with Detective Katie Vanoni and private investigator Kevin Klein, the team submitted the DNA to a genealogical database. The results built a family tree that pointed investigators toward a suspect who had lived quietly for decades in Northern California. PressDemocrat.com. This crucial step transformed the investigation. After nearly 40 years of dead ends, detectives were finally closing in on the person responsible. The family's long struggle. For Sarah Ann Geer's family, the loss was not confined to 1982. It stretched across birthdays, holidays, and milestones that were never reached. In Cloverdale, the Geer family became a symbol of quiet perseverance, carrying the weight of grief while living in a community that never forgot what had happened. In the early days after Sarah's murder, her parents and siblings relied heavily on each other and their neighbors. The town rallied with support, but as the weeks turned into months without an arrest, the silence became more painful. Families who lose children often describe living in a limbo where time passes, but healing never begins. For Sarah's family, that limbo lasted decades. Her absence was felt in every corner of their lives. Classmates moved on to high school, college, and adulthood, while Sarah remained frozen in memory as a 13-year-old seventh grader. Her family carried the loss through each milestone. Every year brought another reminder of what could have been. Another birthday without candles, another anniversary marked not by celebration, but by silence. The family's ordeal was made harder by the lack of answers. There was no one to hold accountable, no trial to attend, no verdict to bring closure. Each time they heard about another arrest or breakthrough in a different cold case, it underscored the emptiness of their own. Sarah's story lingered as an unsolved crime, with no end in sight. Still, they refused to let her memory fade. According to police officials, the family stayed in touch with investigators over the years, asking for updates and reminding law enforcement that Sarah's case still mattered. Their persistence kept pressure on authorities to preserve evidence and remain open to new technologies. PressDemocrat.com. By the time DNA technology matured in the early 2000s, Sarah's parents had already grown older, carrying decades of grief. When detectives developed a male DNA profile from the preserved samples but found no match, it was another crushing disappointment. The science had advanced, but not enough to bring the answers they needed. Then, in 2021, when investigators re-examined the evidence using forensic genealogy, Sarah's surviving family members were notified. The process would take time, but for the first time in decades, there was real progress. Her relatives understood that even if justice came late, it was still justice. For them, the arrest in 2024 of James Unick, the man accused of killing Sarah, was bittersweet. Cloverdale Police Chief Chris Parker said publicly that nothing could undo what happened to Sarah or ease the family's grief, but at least the case was no longer unresolved. KTVU.com. The Geer family's struggle represents the painful reality of many cold case families. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but the waiting comes at a cost, measured in sleepless nights, lost years, and the weight of wondering. Decades of silence. After the first flurry of activity in 1982, Sarah Ann Geer's case gradually slipped into what law enforcement calls cold status. No arrests, no new suspects, and no clear leads left investigators with little to pursue. For the Geer family and the Cloverdale community, the silence that followed was agonizing. During the 1980s and 1990s, advances in forensics were underway, but they were slow to reach smaller agencies. Cloverdale was a small town with limited resources, and Sarah's case required specialized forensic work that wasn't yet widely available. Investigators preserved blood and semen samples from the crime scene, but at the time, there was no database or technology capable of producing a usable DNA match. sfgate.com. The years stretched on. Detectives retired, new officers came in, and Sarah's file moved from one generation of investigators to the next. Each time the case was re-examined, the same frustration returned. The evidence existed, but the science wasn't there yet. This is a reality for thousands of unsolved murders across the United States. Families waiting, communities haunted, investigators keeping files alive in hopes of a future breakthrough. For Sarah's loved ones, every update, or lack of one, was another reminder of how much time had passed. By the 2000s, the case became one of Cloverdale's defining unsolved crimes. Reporters occasionally revisited the story, often on anniversaries, but without progress. It became another cold case headline. When DNA technology matured in the early 2000s, investigators were able to create a male DNA profile from the preserved evidence. This was a major step forward, but once again, the profile failed to match anyone in the National CODIS database. Without a direct match, detectives couldn't move forward. For the Geer family, it was another cruel setback, proof that answers were closer than ever, yet still just out of reach. PressDemocrat.com. Despite the lack of results, the decision to preserve Sarah's evidence turned out to be critical. Many cases from the early 1980s lost key material over time, either through mismanagement or deterioration. Cloverdale police, however, maintained Sarah's samples carefully, ensuring that when technology finally advanced enough, the evidence would still be there. For nearly 4 decades, the Geer case symbolized a broader truth about unsolved murders. Justice may take years, even lifetimes, but with persistence and proper evidence handling, the door never fully closes. When investigators revisited Sarah A.'s case in 2021 with forensic genealogy, a tool that didn't exist when she was killed, the silence that had lasted 39 years was finally broken. Breakthrough after 32 years. By 2021, Sarah Ann Geer's case had been unsolved for nearly 4 decades. It was the oldest active homicide on record in Cloverdale, a reminder of a community's first murder and the decades of questions that followed. But a new generation of investigators, supported by advancing science, was ready to try again. That year, Cloverdale Police Chief Jason Ferguson authorized a fresh review of the evidence. He was joined by Detective Katie Vanoni, who took the lead on the case, and private investigator Kevin Klein, a retired Sonoma County Sheriff's Sergeant who volunteered his time. Their approach was different. Instead of relying solely on CODIS, they turned to forensic genetic genealogy, a tool that had already solved dozens of cold cases nationwide. PressDemocrat.com. The preserved evidence from 1982 included a male DNA profile. Investigators submitted it to genealogical databases used for law enforcement. The process was meticulous. Instead of producing a direct match, genealogy builds family trees by comparing shared DNA with distant relatives already in the system. From there, investigators map out connections, narrowing possibilities until a likely suspect emerges. In Sarah's case, the analysis eventually pointed toward one name: James Unick. Unick, 62 years old at the time of his arrest in 2024, had lived in several Northern California communities over the years. He was not a stranger to Cloverdale. Records showed he had been there in the early 1980s, around the time of Sarah's murder. Yet he had managed to avoid detection for decades. He had prior arrests for unrelated offenses, but nothing that tied him directly to Sarah until the DNA link was established. KTVU.com. Once the genealogical lead was in place, Detectives conducted surveillance and eventually obtained a fresh DNA sample from Unick. When compared against the crime scene profile, it matched. Nearly 42 years after Sarah's murder, Cloverdale police had their suspect. The arrest was announced in April 2024. Unick was taken into custody in Willows, California, and charged with murder, rape, kidnapping, and lewd acts with a child under 14 by force. For the first time since 1982, Sarah's family could see someone held accountable, sfgate.com. At a press conference, Police Chief Chris Parker, who had since succeeded Ferguson, called the arrest a bittersweet victory for justice. He acknowledged the years of pain endured by Sarah's family and thanked the many officers, detectives, and community members who had refused to let the case fade into history. "Justice delayed," he said, "is still justice delivered." PressDemocrat.com. The breakthrough underscored the power of forensic genealogy. In 1982, investigators could do little more than document evidence and wait for science to catch up. By 2024, that same evidence had become the key to unlocking a 42-year-old mystery. It was proof that cold cases can be solved, provided evidence is preserved and investigators remain committed. For Sarah's family, the news brought a measure of relief, though not closure. Decades had passed, parents had grown old, and much of the healing time had already been lost. Still, knowing the truth and seeing a suspect held accountable offered an answer to the question that had haunted them for nearly half a century. The suspect, the man identified as Sarah Ann Geer's killer, was James Unick, a 62-year-old resident of Willows, California, at the time of his arrest in April 2024. His name had never surfaced in the original investigation, and for more than 4 decades, he lived without being linked to Sarah's murder. Unick's background reflects the troubling reality of many cold case suspects. Someone living an outwardly ordinary life while carrying an unpunished crime from the past. Public records show that he had lived in several Northern California towns over the years, including Cloverdale, where Sarah was killed. His presence in the area in 1982 placed him within reach of the crime, but at the time, police lacked any evidence to connect him directly. sfgate.com. Authorities revealed that Unick did have prior arrests, though none tied him to the brutality of Sarah's case. These prior encounters with law enforcement did not trigger suspicion in 1982 because DNA technology was not available. Even when a male DNA profile was developed in the early 2000s, it did not match anyone in CODIS, leaving his name off the radar. It was only through forensic genealogy, comparing the preserved DNA to distant relatives in genealogical databases, that investigators built a family tree leading to Unick. Once he became a person of interest, police gathered a fresh DNA sample and confirmed the match to the crime scene. PressDemocrat.com. The charges brought against him were severe: murder, rape, kidnapping, and lewd and lascivious acts with a minor under 14 by force. Cloverdale Police Chief Chris Parker said the evidence linking Unick to Sarah's death was strong, and prosecutors emphasized that genetic genealogy was only the beginning. Traditional investigative work and DNA confirmation closed the gap. KTVU.com. For many in Cloverdale, the arrest brought shock. Residents who remembered the case from 1982 now knew that the killer had lived freely for decades. For Sarah's surviving relatives, it was another bittersweet moment. They had answers, but they also had to confront the reality that the man accused of taking Sarah's life had walked unnoticed for nearly half a century. The arrest of James Unick highlights a broader pattern in cold cases. Perpetrators are often not strangers to the region where crimes occurred, but without modern tools, their identities remain hidden. Only when science and persistence intersect does justice finally arrive. Court, justice, and closure. When investigators confirmed the DNA link to James Unick, the next step was to bring the case to court. In April 2024, Unick was arrested in Willows, California, and formally charged with murder, rape, kidnapping, and lewd acts with a minor under 14 by force. After more than 4 decades, Sarah Ann Geer's case had finally reached the courtroom. KTVU.com. At his first appearance, Unick stood before a Sonoma County judge to hear the charges against him. Prosecutors emphasized the weight of the preserved evidence, samples collected in 1982, safeguarded through decades, and reanalyzed with tools that had not existed at the time of Sarah's murder. The DNA match was presented as the cornerstone of the case, supported by genealogy records and confirmation testing. PressDemocrat.com. Defense attorneys, as expected in cases relying on decades-old evidence, questioned chain of custody issues and the reliability of genealogical methods. Yet investigators were clear. The DNA evidence from the preserved samples, tested and retested, pointed directly to Unick. The science was modern, but the evidence itself had been collected the night Sarah's body was found. For Sarah's surviving family, the courtroom proceedings were heavy with emotion. After years of waiting without answers, they finally heard a suspect's name spoken under oath. Police Chief Chris Parker called the moment a bittersweet victory. Nothing could undo the suffering Sarah endured or restore the decades her family lost. But the acknowledgement of responsibility mattered. For them, accountability, even if delayed, was an important step. KTVU.com. The trial also highlighted the persistence of Cloverdale investigators. Former and current officers attended hearings, some of whom had been young patrolmen in 1982 when Sarah's murder was first discovered. For them, the case had lingered like unfinished business throughout their careers. The courtroom became a place not only of justice for Sarah's family, but of closure for law enforcement who had carried the weight of an unsolved homicide for decades. Community members also followed the trial closely. Local newspapers reported packed hearings, with residents who remembered the original investigation attending to witness the proceedings. For Cloverdale, Sarah's case was not just another crime. It was the town's first homicide, and the resolution mattered to everyone who had lived under its shadow. While the legal process continues, trials, motions, and hearings can take years, the important breakthrough was that Sarah's case no longer sat unsolved. The Geer family now had a name, a face, and charges filed in court. They had the opportunity to see justice unfold in a way that had once seemed impossible. Chief Parker summarized it best. "We can't give Sarah back to her family, but we can give them the truth." And after 42 years, that truth has finally been delivered. Legacy of the case. The resolution of Sarah Ann Geer's case is more than a single family story. It demonstrates how persistence, careful evidence preservation, and advances in forensic science can finally deliver answers, even after decades of silence. For law enforcement, the case underscores the importance of safeguarding evidence. In 1982, investigators could not have imagined the development of forensic genealogy. Yet because they preserved biological samples, modern technology was able to identify a suspect more than 40 years later. Cloverdale police openly credited the foresight of earlier detectives for giving today's investigators the tools they needed. PressDemocrat.com. The case also highlights the role of community memory. Cloverdale never forgot Sarah, and local officials repeatedly spoke about how the case shaped the town's identity. When the arrest was made in 2024, residents described a sense of collective relief. Justice for Sarah also meant healing for the town. On a broader level, Sarah's case reflects a growing trend. Cold cases across the United States being solved through forensic genealogy. From the Golden State Killer to other long unsolved murders, the method has changed what is possible for investigators. Families who once assumed they would never have answers now see hope in the breakthroughs happening nationwide. For Sarah's relatives, the arrest of James Unick does not erase decades of grief, but it does ensure her case will not remain unfinished. Her story will stand as a reminder of how justice, though delayed, can still arrive. Closing reflection. The story of Sarah Ann Geer is one of loss, endurance, and persistence. It began in 1982 with the tragic death of a 13-year-old girl in a small Northern California town, a crime that shocked a community and left a family devastated. For decades, there were no answers. Her case became a symbol of how time can stall justice, how families are forced to live in uncertainty, and how investigators carry the weight of unfinished work. Yet Sarah's story also shows what is possible when evidence is preserved and determination never fades. The foresight of investigators who carefully stored biological samples, the advances in forensic genealogy, and the persistence of detectives who refused to let her case go cold all combined to deliver justice after more than 40 years. It is a reminder that in the pursuit of truth, time is not always an obstacle. It can be a tool waiting for science to catch up. For her family, the arrest of James Unick was not closure in the truest sense. Closure suggests an end, but grief does not end. What the family received was accountability, the knowledge that someone was finally held responsible for what happened to Sarah. For them, that truth matters. For Cloverdale, Sarah's case will always be its first homicide, the tragedy that marked the town's history. But now it also stands as proof that justice, though delayed, is still possible. As we reflect on this case, one question remains. How many other families are still waiting, still hoping for the call that Sarah's loved ones finally received? Cold cases across the country sit on shelves, waiting for the same combination of science and persistence. Sarah's story shows us that answers are possible, even when it feels too late. We remember Sarah not just as a victim of violence, but as a daughter, a student, and a teenager whose life mattered. Her story is why we keep telling these stories, because remembering is its own form of justice.